Welcome back to Gold Shields. This is Dan Murphy along with my partner in crime, Tom Smith. Every week we bring you the most compelling true crime cases from the mouths of detectives, investigators, and those who chronicle the work of those great men and women right here on Gold Shields. Let's talk a little bit quick before we begin, though, about Fairline Defense. Great friend of the show, fairlinedefense.com. If you like to carry a weapon and you believe in your Second Amendment rights and you legally carry, you're going to need something behind that. Fairline Defense provides an incredible set of benefits for a very affordable rate. It's peace of mind. And if you have a tough split-second moment in your life when you use that firearm, you're going to need Fairline Defense. Criminal defense, unlimited. Up to $1.5 million in civil defense expenses and attorney's fees, so you get the best defense you can have. Critical response team, 24/7. $1,000 a day per diem in case you miss work, and 100% payback. No payback if you lose, I'm sorry. Ensuring peace of mind. You either win or you pay nothing. So, folks, don't wait for trouble to find you. Get ahead of it with Fairline Defense. Carry with peace of mind. Tom, who do we have today? We're both excited about our guest.
Yeah, we got Robyn Maharaj, who is a freelance journalist who did an incredible story, an incredible book on Jeffrey Dahmer with the detective who ran the case. It's going to be a compelling, interesting, seat of your pants kind of interview because what she has is just the facts are great involving the most infamous serial killer in American history. So tune in, stay tuned, don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
Hey, here we are back at Gold Shields as promised. This is Dan Murphy along with Tom Smith, and our guest today is Robyn Maharaj, who is an outstanding journalist and has done a book that, if you have any interest in serial killers or specifically Jeffrey Dahmer, you have to read. Now, one of the things we pride ourselves on here, right, Tom, at Gold Shields, is we want to give you that backstage pass, right? So, a backstage pass for us means something different than just the plain story. What did the detectives and investigators experience? What did they go through? What was their life like during the case and afterwards? In many of these cases, we highlight changed the lives forever. Um, Tom, what is it that you learned in doing some research about Robyn's book? And we'll introduce her in 1 second, but this is just a fascinating look at this case.
It is because it's an angle that you don't hear about much. You don't hear about the way this book was put together too often. And it's a collaboration of just two great people working towards one infamous subject, and that's Jeffrey Dahmer. Talk about your just famous serial killers for all the wrong reasons, obviously, but they do become celebrities. And Jeffrey Dahmer was one of them. And Robin's story, along with Patrick Kennedy, who's a Milwaukee detective who was very much involved in the case of Jeffrey Dahmer, and them getting together and coming up with this book was remarkable. We spoke to Robyn the other day, and we're just dumbfounded by the amount
Hmm.
of facts and her story, which we can't wait to get to. So we're not going to wait too much longer. So Robyn, welcome to Gold Shields, and thank you for coming.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me on your show, you guys. This is going to be wonderful, and I look forward to our conversation and discussion.
So you research and work on. You're a freelance journalist and work on a lot of different subjects. What drew you to the Dahmer case? Tell us how this all began.
Well, as I mentioned, and as you said in your introduction of me, I am a freelance writer. And so, what happens very often with freelancing, especially if you're working with editors or you're working with people who are giving assignments, is you don't really have much of a say. They kind of say, "Can you go and do the story?" And you're testing your mettle because you're doing the research. And when you're a young writer, it's fascinating because you're learning about subjects that you don't really know a lot about. And it's fascinating to talk to people who are experts, on the subject. But I guess when I hit about 40 years old, I thought, I just kind of want to work on things that I'm interested in. What do I read about? What am I interested in? What do I like to talk about? And true crime has always been, a subject that I've been interested in. I like investigative discovery programs. I like true crime books. I've always, even as a young reader, like, 10, 11, 12 years old, I was fascinated by detective stories. So I thought true crime is an area that I wanted to explore as a freelance writer. And so around that time, I was sort of thinking of what I was going to write about. Jeffrey Dahmer didn't immediately come to mind, but I was thinking it'd be interesting to write about someone who was, sort of well known, but maybe look at a slightly different way at them, like look at them in a slightly different way. But I'd seen a show, and it was sort of talking about, the top 10 most evil people in history. And he was listed, Jeffrey Dahmer was listed as number 3. So it was like Hitler, Stalin, Jeffrey Dahmer. And I guess my feeling was like, I know he was a bad guy. I know he did a lot of awful things, and he was, he killed people. But, is he really quite up there with those guys, like with Stalin and with Hitler? So it kind of made me curious. And I thought, I really want to learn more about him. I'd read sort of the highlights, and I knew a little bit about what Dahmer had done, kind of knew the timeline a little bit, but I thought, I'm more interested in finding out why he did what he did. And I looked at a couple of the books and articles and things that were out there, and a lot of them really focused on sort of the grisly angles of the Dahmer story, sort of the gratuitous violence and sort of the goriness of it. And I said, I'm not interested in that. I want to really find out about Dahmer himself. So that's kind of where I got the idea. And then I had seen an interview on YouTube with Kennedy and Christopher Thompson, who's a local filmmaker. Well, local in that he's in Wisconsin. And he had just done a film about Jeffrey Dahmer, and he had interviewed Pat Kennedy and a couple of other people. And so I immediately thought, I got to talk to Kennedy. He's going to be a good person, a good source for me to talk to about this article, because he spent so much time with Jeffrey, and he must have had some kind of an idea about sort of what was going on with him in his mind when he was talking about these crimes and when he was talking about his victims. What else was he saying? And so I reached out, first of all, to Christopher, who put me in touch with Pat. And I just basically told him, I want to do an article on Dahmer, and I kind of want to find out, a little bit more about him in terms of who he was personality wise, and what led him to become a criminal and a murderer. And so we just began, Patrick Kennedy and I just began this email correspondence for a couple of months. And in the course of that correspondence, I guess he realized that, I was serious about what I was saying. I didn't want to just sort of do something that was going to be gratuitous. I really wanted to kind of ask some questions and get some answers. So he did a couple of things. He said, I've got some notes and reports and different things that I've, kind of accumulated over the years. You can have a look at them if you want. So he was going to send them to me. He said, I'm happy to be an interviewee for you if you like. And then he invited me to come down to Wisconsin. He said, I'm going to be in Madison for a film festival. Chris's film is being shown there. Why don't you come down and we can actually do this face to face? Because I think at that point he thought perhaps I could be useful to him in terms of somebody who could look at whatever writing he had. Like he sort of said, this is as much as I can do with it. I kind of need to work with a writer and an editor. You sound like you could do this. So we sort of talked about maybe working together, and we met and we had a lovely dinner in Madison. And we talked about Jeffrey Dahmer, amongst other things, but we talked a lot about Jeffrey Dahmer. And he kind of walked me all through everything that happened in terms of his first encounter with Jeffrey Dahmer. And then after that, we decided, okay, we're going to continue our communication and continue to work together. So I came back to Canada, to Manitoba, where I live, and he went back to Milwaukee. And the day or two after we had our interview, he sent me his reports and notes. And he said, let's just keep the dialogue open here. Let's just keep going. So about 4 days later, I got a message from the director that I mentioned, Christopher. And he said, I don't know how to tell you this, but he said, Patrick had a fatal heart attack at home and he died. He was home alone and he died. So he was 59 years old, still a very young man in my opinion. And so I was crushed. I was like, how could I have just seen this man 5 days ago and had dinner or sat across the table from him and had these, really interesting conversations, and now he's just gone. So, I kind of was looking through his material when I found out about his passing. And I thought, I'm just going to continue on as if he's still here. I'm going to continue to make my notes, make my suggestions. And the least I can do is I can give it to his widow, to his wife, Patty, and let her decide what's going to happen with it. And in the meantime, I'm going to write my article. I'll send her a copy of it and we'll see. So once I had sent her the article, she said, I think you really had a good handle on the relationship between Kennedy and Dahmer. So she said, this nothing's going to happen with your notes. It's just going to go back into his desk drawer. and nothing may come of it. And to me, that was just too sad. It's like this wonderful detective story. I felt like, he passed away. That shouldn't be preventing him from his story coming out. So I said, I'm going to do what I can. So that was in 2013. I continued to kind of work on it, put it together, and flesh it out, if you will. And then it came out as Dahmer Detective in 2016. Wild Blue took it over and sort of turned it into Grilling Dahmer, which is the book that you know now. And that came out in 2021.
So
That's amazing.
Patrick Kennedy
Talk about
had
like
the yeah. Go ahead. I was going to say Patrick Kennedy
go
had
ahead,
the
Dan.
lead role in the Interrogation, and it was something like 12 hours a day,
Yes,
6 days a week. He spent a lot of time with Jeffrey Dahmer.
very intense. Yeah,
Yeah, and he
yeah,
developed a rapport, which
very
was very
intense.
critical. Hello, he developed a rapport
Yeah,
with Jeffrey Dahmer, correct?
Yes, I'm sorry, you just froze up there for a
I'm
second.
sorry. Yeah.
Yes, and kind of how that came about, like how Dahmer came to New Kennedy, is that like when Dahmer was first in his apartment, and this last victim of his had escaped, had got out on the street midnight, handcuff dangling from his arm, runs into these police in a police car, these uniformed police, and says, I just want to get these cuffs off. And he was hoping that they would have a key that they could actually take the cuff off. And they said, these are not the same that we issue, so we're going to have to go back to the place where you had the handcuff put on, and then we'll get the key. And so he didn't want to go back. Like, he was scared, he was terrified, he didn't want to go back to that apartment. But they convinced him, it's okay, you're with us, you'll be safe. So they all went back. Tracy Edwards was the fellow, and the two police in uniform. And so they basically are at the threshold, and they're just saying, we don't have a lot of questions. We don't ask you a lot of stuff. We just want to get the key for this guy so he can get the handcuff off, and then everyone can get on with their night. And he, of course, Dahmer is like, oh yeah, yeah, sure, come on in. He had been drinking that night, and so he was a little bit inebriated. He didn't realize, of course, that he didn't have the key handy. He didn't know where the key was, but he was sort of fumbling around trying to pretend to find it. And that's when the police, of course, noticed the smell in the apartment, and they noticed these photographs that were kind of lying around, and they said, what is this guy doing with these pictures that were clearly taken from the medical examiner's office, because it was parts of bodies in these photos. And then they realized these are photos that are taken in the room where we're standing, and so they said, grab him. Like, one guy said to the other cop, grab him, and they got him down, and he was wrestling around, he was fighting them, and so he was on the ground, and that's when they handcuffed him. Then that's, they called the police, and then that's when the uniformed police came, and that was the very first time that Kennedy met Jeffrey. He actually walked through the door, and the first thing Jeff said to him was, "You're not going to beat me up too, are you?" And Kennedy said, "No, I'm not here to beat you up." He said, "Let's get him up, and I'm here to listen to you. I want to talk to you, and I want to listen to your story." And so, for whatever reason, that really resonated with Dahmer, and he never forgot that. So he went down to the police station, and he said, "I'm not talking to anybody, but I'll talk to Kennedy." So he made it really clear that the only person he was going to tell anything to was going to be Patrick Kennedy.
wow.
Wow.
And then you know what? As a detective, you take advantage of that. You take advantage of that when you have a perp that wants to talk and he's keyed on one guy. The rest of the team backs off. It's all yours, and you give it to
Hmm.
him because that's what's going to work. Especially when you have a request like that from what you are potentially staring at. Uh, Now let's go into a little bit, and like I said, your story is so compelling because you're actually giving a firsthand account, but not having a firsthand account. Through
Hmm.
Patrick's great work and note taking, which led you to do this. And the honor that you show him, I'm going to say again later in the show, but you do, because you could have very easily just went, oh my God, it's horrible. He's gone. That's it. And then just went on. And you didn't do that. You took his hard work, his dedication, and a case that is, I mean, as historic as they come, and kept him alive. You kept his spirit alive, you kept his work alive with his
Hmm.
notes, and you didn't give up on that. You could have done it, very easily done it, and you didn't want to. And I think with the help of his wife, uh, got you going and came up with this book, which was incredible to do. And it's a great honor. You did a great job, Robyn, with it. So, with
Hmm.
that being said, tell us a little about that night that Patrick put in his notes about Dahmer's residence and
Hmm.
responding there. And that actually the anniversary wasn't too long ago. It was July 22nd. So it was only
That's
last
right.
week
Yeah.
was actually the anniversary of
Hmm.
this. Uh,
That's right.
what did Patrick talk about that night walking into an absolute horrific scene?
Well, initially they had gotten this call, and you guys will know this more than anyone. When you're a cop, you're sort of on a rotation, and so he came in at midnight, and they're all in homicide. They're waiting for that call, and they're sort of in this rotation, and so they he walks in, he's getting his coffee, he's talking to his partner, kind of figuring out sort of the plan for the night, and then their captain comes in and says, there's a call that's just come in, something about a head in the fridge. You're going to have to go check it out. And they're, of course, thinking, like, this is a joke. It's a hoax. This isn't real. But they're kind of joking a little bit, like, hope we don't lose our heads over this kind of thing. And the captain's saying, I know it's probably nothing, probably going to be just a big waste of your time, but you got to go check it out. We have to go check it out. So it just was one of those things where, it was just sort of like, his name came up, Kennedy's name came up, and his partner's name came up, and they had to sort of, that was sort of his introduction to this whole story, and they are going off in their car, and they're, again, sort of making these jokes. And it was a very, very hot night. I remember him saying that. And they get into the apartment. And in fact, when they got to the building, it looked familiar to Kennedy, because he said not that long before the Dahmer case broke, they'd actually been to that apartment and investigating like a potential homicide. So the building was kind of familiar to him. And as they were getting closer and closer to the apartment, they were just hit with this odor, this smell that so many people had complained about. Neighbors had complained about. Dahmer's caretaker had complained about. Like, it was just pervasive. So as soon as they kind of smelled this odor as they're approaching, Dahmer's door, they're thinking to themselves, maybe there's something to this. Like, maybe we were too quick to make jokes. So they knock on the door and they get in there. And I guess Kennedy's first sort of reaction was this guy on the floor. He said this sort of disheveled looking blonde man, sort of thin, kind of tall, had glasses on his face, and he was down on the ground. And so they got him up, and so he was sort of like thinking, this guy looks very unassuming, doesn't look like a killer. Looked very kind of, aside from being kind of disheveled, I mean, he looked pretty neat and tidy otherwise, kind of a clean cut looking guy. But he said the apartment was very tiny, very small, and it just smelled like it smelled bad. And so the two cops, the two uniformed police officers said, because they were kind of like anxious as well. Like, they were sort of like, this was nothing that they had ever encountered before. So they said, Pat, you got to go look at the fridge. So even though he'd been kind of warned, like, I mean, the captain had told him there's something about a head in the fridge, and this one other detective is telling him, I don't think it even, with all of that, prepared him for what he saw. But he
Hmm.
just went over, he opened the fridge door, and sitting in a box was a severed head, like a freshly severed head, and that was it. I mean, there was a few other things in the fridge, but essentially that was like the main thing. And to hear Kennedy describe it, he said, he just felt floored. Like, he said, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and he just had this fear, like he couldn't believe it, and he felt sort of grounded to the floor. And it's a feeling that he said, I can recreate that feeling anytime I want. He said, if I go back and just think about that moment, I can actually feel it like it's really happening all over again. And this is like 30 years later, 25 years later, let's say. So yeah, so I mean, his feeling was, I think, at that moment of seeing that image, was, this is nothing I've ever encountered before. This is nothing that I've ever had any experience for. And actually, if you think about it, like back in 91, Kennedy was 37 years old. So I mean, he was experienced, but I mean, he didn't have a whole lot of experience. I mean, he had been in other areas of detective work and had made homicide. But I think in terms of the other guys in that department, he was still a little new, still a bit of a newbie. And you're right, exactly. When the suspect is saying, I want to talk to this particular detective, I think the others were saying, we need to send in someone more seasoned. But the captain said, no, this guy's not, this guy wants to talk to Pat. He's going to talk to
Hmm. And that's the right decision to make. Like as Tom said before, when that rapport is built, when an initial draw or that initial openness to speak to a specific person is there, you follow it. So that was the right move by his boss. and he certainly
Right.
seized it.
And
But you know,
they didn't know this at the time, but like Jeffrey was very much the kind of person that any kind of like confrontation or asking questions or whatever, he would just shut down. Like he would just stop talking. Like
hmm
he was a very shy guy, he had no problems, just kind of like being quiet. So the fact that they did that, the fact that they said, let Kennedy talk to him and see what we can get out of him. I think if they had sent in a older, more angry cop, he probably would have just said nothing.
hmm
Yeah.
yeah, there's different interview styles, and detectives, they often fall into what seems to work for them, whether that be being hard with somebody or being, very easygoing and open. It really is up to the individual, and it's up to the moment at at hand. Who are you speaking to? What's their demeanor like? But apparently, he found a way, something about his style, his personality, his demeanor clicked with Jeffrey Dahmer. So he had a lot of conversations with him, and a lot of it is documented. But what did he describe to you when you talked about what he took away from Jeffrey in terms of just his personality, some of the things he said? What did he learn about him that maybe isn't in the papers everywhere? People seem to think serial killers are just these crazy people walk around killing people left and right. Well, this is a guy that blended in with the mosaic of Milwaukee. Nobody paid any attention to him. What was
Mhm.
his motivations and mindset and likes and dislikes? Tell us what you can about what you learned from Patrick Kennedy about him.
Yeah, well, I think that Kennedy's assessment of Dahmer was very much what we all kind of have come to know about him, which that he was very unassuming, almost boring, like Dahmer was. I mean, he was sort of just like quiet and not very curious, not very ambitious. He had very bizarre tastes in things, like the things that he wanted to occupy his time, like this all this business with roadkill and collecting dead animals and being interested in the insides of dead things. Like these were all things that I think Kennedy found to be very bizarre. Like I think he thought that Jeffrey was a very bizarre guy. But he also said, he was pleasant, he was polite. He said, I've talked to and interrogated a lot of guys who did a lot less and that were a lot more rude about
Mhm.
it and didn't want to talk and were not, please and thank you. And so he found him to be, like quite unassuming, but very polite and actually respectful of the police. I think that was kind of how Dahmer was able to operate for so long and actually had those kind of couple of close calls where he could have been caught but wasn't, and that was just because Dahmer was so deferential. Yes sir, no sir, just Mr. Polite, and no one would suspect him of anything. I think, and this is interesting because I've had a couple conversations with people who'll say, well, God, Dahmer, I mean, like that was so long ago. What could you possibly learn from that still? And I think, well, one of the things that I learned from Kennedy about Dahmer was, these are all issues like bullying, alienation, isolation, kind of feeling like you don't fit in. Maybe having so much time that you can fantasize, and then those fantasies go dark. In Dahmer's case, he was an alcoholic, which is another thing that Kennedy picked up on pretty quickly. Like especially that first night, he could see Dahmer coming down from being drunk, and so that was the thing that they actually did have in common because Pat was a recovering alcoholic himself. So I think that he just felt that his best approach, and I think he's used this or had used this in other times in talking with suspects, was just almost kill them with kindness. Just kind of like just be nice, be respectful, get them a cup of coffee if they want. Do they want a cigarette? Do they want a sandwich? Are they hungry? Just kind of ask them a lot of stuff. Just make them comfortable. And one of the things that Kennedy kept saying was, I'm not here to judge you. That's not my job. My job is just to talk to you, hear what you have to say, tell me what you're going to tell me, and, just answer my questions, basically. He said, it's not up to me to judge you. It's really just to kind of get your story and find out what happened, like find out how all of this happened.
Wow. Incredible. Uh, what a skill set, to like you said, maybe not having that much experience in that. I mean, listen, none of us sit down, go to work every day, think we're going to sit down with a serial killer, so you're not even really prepared for that. But to kind of just hone in on what was sitting in front of him, I think he did a masterful job at. And like Dan said, I mean, the best call in the world is his captain or whoever it was recognizing that he has to start this. Now, if it goes bad halfway through it, then you switch it up and you do what you need to do. But initially, having the request of him in your mind and acknowledging it was a great call. Uh, did Patrick go into in his notes? Take us through just how do I say it? Just what happened? Like, how did listen? He was I was a little taken back when I started, reading a little bit more about this, getting ready for the show, that this was a 12 or 13-year process. This wasn't just a crime spree and he went on a killing spree for a couple of weeks. This was over years that he did this. Uh, and the worst criminal in the world, as Dan will attest to this, is a patient criminal. They're bad. They're a nightmare to deal with. And when you have a serial killer with that evilness going over that time frame is wild. Did Pat go into just tell us about what he was like? How did it all happen? Picking his victims, choosing the victims that he did, and how and why, and all that.
Sure. Well, initially, and anybody who's watched the Netflix thing about Dahmer will know this, but, initially he had killed a young man when he was like 18, 19 years old. And, Dahmer maintained that it was an accident, right? Like he had been out driving in Ohio because that's where he was living at the time. And he saw this hitchhiker who was actually on his way headed west to go to a music festival. And he said, hey, why don't you come over to my place? We'll have a couple beers, maybe smoke a joint and listen to some music, whatever. And then I'll give you a ride to your next stop to get to your festival. So the guy said, sure. He had been out hitchhiking. He was trying to get a ride. This guy was offering. So they ended up going to the house that the Dahmers owned in Bath, Ohio. And that's exactly what they did. They opened a couple of drinks and they were kind of, talking, comparing ideas and things about music and just chatting basically. And this kid was saying, okay, I gotta go. Like, I gotta go. I've got friends that are meeting me. I have to leave. And that was something that Dahmer just was not good with. Like, he was not good with people leaving him. He did not want to be abandoned. And I think all of those things had been things that he had struggled with earlier in his life. Like his dad was a workaholic. So he was not home a lot. He was working a lot. He was doing research. His mom suffered from mental illness, diagnosed mental illness. So there was times when she was in hospital, and so she was not around. Then when she would be at home, she was often medicated or sleeping, or the parents were fighting. Right. So there was a lot of time that Dahmer had to kind of be on his own, and so he he did feel abandoned because eventually, once his parents' marriage ended, his mom left and just took the younger brother, left Dahmer at home because he's like, you have to finish high school, so you might as well finish it here. So he had been just left at home. So when this hitchhiking kid, started saying, I got to go, Dahmer was like, I don't want him to leave. I don't want him to leave at all. I want to have him stay. So they kind of started wrestling and fighting, and Dahmer picked up what turned out to be the handle of a weight, and he hit him on the head. And I think it was really just to sort of like detain him. I don't think he meant to kill him, but he did. He did kill him. He hit him in the head so severely that he died. And I think it shocked Dahmer, but at the same time it excited him because what his fantasies had always been about was actually having a a lover, a male lover, that he could just do whatever he wanted to do with a person. He didn't really want to be in a relationship. He would say, I want to have a boyfriend or I want to be with somebody and have like a relationship. But he didn't really want that. He just really wanted somebody that was completely compliant and would do whatever he wanted to do. So he kept the body for a little while and then he eventually did dispose of it at that property. But for the longest time, Dahmer was scared. He was just waiting for that knock at the door, that phone call, something that was going to say, we know somehow that you had an encounter with this kid and that you're responsible for his disappearance. But it never happened. And Dahmer kind of went through this stage of just sort of like thanking his lucky stars and committing himself to being a better person. And I mean, he went through a bunch of stuff. I mean, he graduated from high school. He had kind of washed out of college. He drank his way out of college, basically. He had gotten started, gotten registered, but was drinking all the time. So he got kicked out. Then his parents, his dad and his stepmother suggested, why don't you go into the army? So that's what he did. And he went off. And I think initially started off doing pretty well, but then eventually the lure of alcohol came and then he was washed out of that and then discharged. So then he's just started into like a series of dead end jobs, and then he was kind of going nowhere. But his family, his dad especially, said, you know what, why don't you go and live with grandma? She could use the help. You could use a little bit of direction. Maybe it'll be a new start for you. And so that's kind of where it ended up. And so in the back of Dahmer's mind, though, through all of this period of time was always that guilt that he said he felt, that, this kid just kind of encountered him and he died. But at the same time, it excited him, the fantasy of that and the remembering of it all the time. That was really a turn on for Dahmer. So I think that was like a turning point for him, was that he had been just sitting in a library and somebody kind of threw a note at him. It was a man that threw a note at him and said, if you want a blowjob, meet me in the bathroom. Dahmer didn't take him up on this offer, but he kind of came away from that experience thinking, you know what, I'm not fooling anybody. He was sort of trying to hide his homosexuality, but he said, it's not working. People can identify me and they know I'm gay. And so I should just, kind of accept it, I guess. And that's really when he kind of got into this dark area where he's like, you know what, I want to meet guys, I want to meet men and do what I want with them. So he did. He started going to gay bars. He started going to bathhouses. But, again, he wasn't really looking for a quote unquote normal relationship. He just wanted a partner he could just do whatever he wanted to do. There were certain things about gay sex that he liked, certain things that he didn't like. And Dahmer was just kind of like, I just want somebody I can just do things with. I want to do things to the body and not have anyone say, oh, stop that, or that hurts, or anybody to kind of fight him or confront him. And so he ended up drugging and, drugging people's drinks at the bathhouses. And then he got caught. So they said, you're kicked out, don't come back. And then I guess very quickly he realized, I don't have to go to a place to meet a guy and do this. I can just bring them back to my apartment. By that time, he was living on his own in Milwaukee. And so began this sort of pattern of what you would call like bringing these men home. Initially, he just really kind of wanted to keep them. I call them zombie boyfriends, just kind of like keep them drugged and compliant. But eventually he was doing that. They would pass out and then he would strangle them, because his interest was still, the insides of dead things, right? Like he liked the body, he liked doing the things to the body, he liked the muscles and the way things looked on the body, but he was also very interested in the insides of dead things, which was something that was a carryover from his younger days.
Wow.
So yeah, so I think that, just to go back to your initial question, like I think Kennedy was quite, he was kind of like perplexed by this guy, because he says, I have no idea where these dark fantasies and these dark actions are coming from. And he would even say to Jeff, why didn't you just get a boyfriend? Like, why didn't you're a good looking guy. You don't even have any problems picking up men. Why don't you just get a boyfriend? And, Dahmer could never really answer that. He'd say, well, eventually the person would want to go, either want to leave him or they'd want to do something that he wasn't interested in doing. So I think it was just about keeping that lover with him for as long as he could.
So, did Patrick Kennedy ever talk to you about any justification or any rationalization that Jeffrey Dahmer may have made for his actions? Now, it's very typical for people to blame, it's human nature. We blame somebody else for our actions. Did he blame his upbringing? Did he blame his parents? Did he blame alcohol, the military? Was there any, or was it a combination, or did he accept full responsibility? Or did he say, I have a mental illness? I mean, just curious, what was his rationalization?
Yeah. I think because like that first night, Dahmer, I guess because he had been so cocky in the past and had success actually of like kind of talking his way out of trouble. Like, when he was a young man and he had that hitchhiker, he was going to actually dispose of the body at the dump. And he actually got stopped by a police officer who's like, why are you driving out here so late at night? And he managed to talk his way out of it. And the guy just let him go. And another night where a young person had escaped actually the apartment. And the police kind of listened to Dahmer, and Dahmer said, "This is my boyfriend," even though the neighbors were all saying, "No, this is a kid. He goes to school with my cousin's niece or whatever." And the police chose to listen to Dahmer because I don't know, he just sounded legitimate, I guess. And again, very polite. He wasn't sounding crazy or anything. He was just sort of very calmly explaining, I left my drunk lover upstairs and I went out to get more beer and he escaped. So they wheeled him back, got the kid back upstairs, and then Dahmer killed him very shortly after. So I think because Dahmer had such success kind of talking his way out of things, he was actually shocked when he was in that interrogation room with Kennedy. And Kennedy said, well, we have people going through your apartment right now. Like they're tearing that place apart right now. And he kind of sat up in his chair and said, really? Like he had no idea. He just thought that they had brought him down, and, they just thought they were going to have some questions for him. But I think once he realized that this is it, I'm sort of, the jig is up and they've caught me. He just wanted to be honest, and he just wanted to sort of tell them everything about it. And I think that as far as trying to find excuses for it, I mean, I think Kennedy, because of his own personal experience with alcoholism, was able to say, alcohol is an inhibitor, and it might have made you do some of the things that you might not have otherwise have done. Dahmer's lawyers were also looking in terms of his mental illness, and whether there was any mental illness there that could have affected why he did what he did. And so I don't think Jeff kind of glommed onto any one thing, but I think he was open to ideas. Like he was open to like, hey, maybe I should talk to a psychiatrist because maybe there is something wrong with me. Like, I mean, he knew that there was something wrong with him. He knew that what he was doing was not right. And, he wasn't telling people he was doing it. I mean, he was doing it all very secretively, and he was getting away with it because if you think about other serial killers, there's usually, like bodies, right? People are finding bodies. And so they know we've got somebody that we got to look out for. Well, in Dahmer's case, he was disposing them in such a way that, family members were coming to the police and saying, our brother or husband or cousin is missing, but there was really no trace of anybody. And these guys, the guys that were typically Dahmer's victims were really big, muscular guys. And these are like, police would look at these pictures and say, like, these guys can handle themselves. They're not going to have gotten into any kind of danger, not realizing that there was this serial killer amongst them who was actually making these really big, strong guys very docile, because he'd invite them into his home. He'd fix them a drink that was laced with drugs, and they would pass out. So they became very easy victims, even though they didn't necessarily look like easy victims. But I think for the most part, one of the things that really kind of made me, another reason why I was interested in writing about Dahmer, was because he actually did take responsibility. Whether you believe whether he says he's sorry or not, that's up to each individual. But I think he really did feel as though the only thing I can do at this point is to help the police identify these guys. Because back in 91, like, they had DNA, but I mean, it's not anything like what we have now. And so to put names to these victims was really important, and that they couldn't have done it without Dahmer. So it was really important that they were working with him and keeping him happy and keeping him into that feeling of like, you're doing the right thing here, Dahmer. You're doing the right thing at this point.
And that goes back again. We keep going back to the initial decision to let Pat do this. And all the positive evidence that came out of this goes back to that initial call of let Pat do this. And Dan and I have been involved in interrogations that last hours, and you hope with every word that you get the confession, you get the details, you get this. And this Pat's determination in it was such that Jeff was talking, and now it was just a matter of time and documenting it correctly, because, like you said, he kind of wasn't hiding anything anymore. And, to have that focus over that length of time, I mean, it was about what, like 6 weeks, 16 hours a day, over and over again. And that can get, that's going to take a toll on you. I don't care how, all right,
Yeah,
we need to get this guy, the gruesome, unbelievable details that he was
right.
laying out for Pat has to take a toll on you. Did Pat talk about that with you, with that just emotional part of it? We can all be who we are, but after a while, it's going to hit you. It's going to take a toll on you mentally. Did Pat talk about that as well?
A little bit. I mean, I think for him, he was really one of these like rock strength guys. He was really a rock.
Mm.
So I mean, absolutely, it had to have affected him, and I think I think it affected him in that in the beginning. He's like, this guy loves me. He's talking to me, and this is like a case that will make a career kind of thing. And it was the people around him, like his family, his wife at the time, particularly, who was worried, thinking like this is the kind of case that could drive a person back to drinking. And so she was very concerned about that, that he might start to drink again. Pat sort of seemed to be like, no, I'm in control of this. I don't, I'm not worried about it at all. The captain was saying, we want you guys to talk to like a doctor or a psychiatrist afterwards. And just to be able to unleash, like after you've heard all this and you've spent all this time with this guy, you need to be able to like get it off your chest. And I think actually that's why Pat wrote things out the way he did. It wasn't just sort of a matter of his old reports and his old notes. I think after everything was said and done, and they took Dahmer off to prison, I think he absolutely had to get all this off of his chest, and that's why the writing part of it. And writing can be very therapeutic, obviously talking, writing, and I think that really helped him sort of go through. But he never really stopped thinking about the case. You know what I mean? Because and I said this to you guys the other night. For years, 25 years later, people are still like, oh, you're the Dahmer detective. Like he was recognizable. Kennedy certainly was in Milwaukee. Big man, like 6'8", big guy. So, they knew him. They knew who he was. They knew he was connected with the Dahmer case. I think that probably out of all of it, like I think when they sort of started into the routine of the day to day, that and kind of like he almost used the word like workman kind of like attitude towards it. We're just going to sit down, going to get through as much as we can today, identify as many victims as we can today. But I think that very first night had to have been just amazing because here he's got this guy in this terrible smelling apartment, got a head in the fridge. But they didn't know anything else. They didn't know about all the different missing men. They didn't know about the cannibalism, the necrophilia. They didn't know any of that. And what it was is Kennedy in this tiny little interrogation room that first night, and every so often he's coming out and getting filled in by the other cops who are saying, guess what we found, or you'll never believe what we saw,
Right.
And so he kind of had to arm himself with all this new information. It was just kind of breaking. And again, like police trucks and hazmat are going over to the apartment because they're concerned about what is in that apartment. They see these big drums. They're wondering, are there chemicals? Is there going to be a bomb or explosion that's going to go off? And then the media, like media trucks started showing up, right? So I kind of always pictured like him in this little room, the two of them sort of sitting across from each other, and there's just this amazing thing that's going on around them while they're starting to collect the information about what Dahmer had done, and just really basically scratching the surface. The media's picking up on things because they're hearing stories, and yeah, just sort of this incredible energy, and also just this horrific feeling of like, what, how bad is this going to get? How many victims are we talking about here?
So when the story first came out, when it first broke, of course, it's globally newsworthy that you have somebody who kept a severed head in their freezer, somebody who was drugging and killing people, a serial killer. That gets headlines right away, and then layers of it come out. And one of the layers that came out, and it didn't take very long, was all the missteps by the Milwaukee Police Department that allowed Jeffrey Dahmer to continue to kill. And you made reference to it before that Jeffrey had spoken about how he couldn't believe he got away with some of the things he got away with. But it was a big black eye for the Milwaukee Police Department. They did not look good at all. Specifically, the one case of the 13-year-old boy who was returned back to him. Dahmer claimed he was 19. They were drinking. A horrifically bad set of missteps by the Milwaukee police officers involved in it that night. Did Patrick talk about what that did to his work and what the detectives did by unraveling the life and works of Jeffrey Dahmer helped restore some confidence to the public? That's a big responsibility. You're cleaning up one of your fellow officers' messes, and it was more than one. And so, did he ever talk about that, what that felt like, or how much pressure there was internally? I know the media was probably taking pot shots at them every day. Did he mention that kind of stuff to you?
Yeah, I think that like most officers in that position would probably feel very protective of of the fellow officers. Yes, admitting maybe yeah, there was maybe some more questions that should have been asked, and Pat did say that. Like he said, if it had been him, he felt. He said, I would have asked a few more questions. Like he kind of felt that, but yeah, I think you have to also look back at the time in '91. Like we didn't know about a Jeffrey Dahmer prior to that, so this was just an unbelievable kind of situation. Nowadays, maybe if you sort of saw a guy, body parts or whatever, you'd put it together a little bit quicker. But at that time, it was sort of sort of unbelievable from that point of view. There was a lot of stuff about the training. Like he said, the training that they had at that time was to listen to the person that's talking to you in the community. If you're out there and you're out policing, the ones that sort of make the most sense, that you connect with. And so he said, those guys that were there that night with that 13-year-old boy, they listened to Dahmer because he looked the most like them, he sounded the most like them. They thought that the neighbors who were getting sort of like very upset were actually hysterical, and so they just sort of thought, well, they don't know what they're talking about. And this guy is very calm, very reasonable. Said that he had mentioned that he was just going out for beer, holds up the beer cans, like he just sounded really legitimate. But yeah, I mean, I think that he had to ride. Yeah, he was getting this story from Dahmer, but he had to ride that wave of embarrassing missteps, the things that were pointed out in the media and the community. Like a lot of people felt that this was race related. First of all, a lot of his victims were black, but also in terms of like the victims were black, and so how come there wasn't more interest when the family members were coming to say, our loved one is missing. They went off to a party and we've never seen them since.
Right.
And the police are just saying, oh, yeah, he's probably just run away somewhere. Or he's tired of his life in Milwaukee and he's just taken a flyer. No one seemed to take seriously the fact that there was these, missing men in the community. So I think Kennedy was very much of the idea of being protective of the fellow police officers, admitting mistakes had been made, but really let's look at this as an opportunity to train new officers and like train and change the way we do things so that we don't ever have anything like this happen again.
Wow. Wow. Uh,
And that's exactly what he did. Like he went on to be continued with the police force for another 10 years. I think he retired in 2001, but then he went back to school. He became a criminologist and he wanted to teach other would-be law enforcement and use the Dahmer case as a way of, cautionary tale, if you will, or here's the things that had been done back then that we don't do that way anymore. Um, a lot of people were very, very critical of the police. And I have to admit that I would have been too, because they said, had they actually just taken that extra step and ran his name, they would have seen that he actually had some previous convictions, a bit of trouble with the law when it came to young men. And they would have done something at that point. But unfortunately, back then it was kind of like, in that Netflix thing they were talking about, they didn't want to stay in his apartment anymore because it was like an apartment of a couple of gay guys, right? So that was their attitude, is like, we just want to get out of here as quickly as we can. And so for those kind of things, I think that Patrick did say, there was a black eye for sure on the Milwaukee police for years to come. But it really served as a preface for them to actually make improvements.
right. Okay.
Well, there can
Now,
be a tendency among all people to make assumptions based upon past experience, right? How many times have you had somebody hysterical run up to your car when you're a cop, and turns out to be just drunkenness, or it turns out to be just hysteria that's based in no real criminal activity or threat, and after a while you get blasé about it, and that came to bite them in this case.
Sure. Yeah.
yep. Now, you know what? Dan and I, in doing cases together and separate, when you're doing an interrogation, sometimes you don't know when to stop because you don't know what's going to be said next, or what did you miss, and hoping you didn't miss anything. And when you have such a complex case and interrogation going on for weeks and weeks and weeks with what's being told of you, it's a movie. I mean, first of all, you're sitting there thinking this is fake because you're
Hmm.
thinking that someone can't be this evil that's sitting in front of you that you actually caught. Uh, did Pat? I'm wondering if the thought process of, when do I stop? Like, when's the end of this interrogation? And trying to figure that out and balance that out must have been just a mind blow of, do I stop now? And I can just imagine putting myself in that position for a second. You kind of think in your head, all right, I'm done. I think I'm coming to an end. And then Jeffrey says something else. You're like, oh my God. Okay, hold on. And you just
Yeah,
start
yeah.
writing again, so that'll
Right.
trigger even more of, was there a discussion, or if how did it end? I mean, how do you stop?
Well, I think it was just a matter. Well, I mean, one of the things that I think amazed Kennedy was that he had Dahmer had this amazing memory. Like he
Right.
was sifting through these pictures. Oh yeah, this guy, that guy. I met him. He could remember dates and he could remember locations, and so I think that they tested him too, right? Because they weren't sure. Like they didn't know whether he was maybe lying to them, exaggerating, giving them false leads. So they were testing him occasionally with different things, and he always seemed to pass the test as far as lying. I think that they sort of thought, okay, he's talking, we'll get him talking. But there were times when he was not lying to them, but he wasn't necessarily coming forward with information. And probably the biggest thing was when the cannibalism, right? Like he didn't want to talk about that right away, and he didn't admit it right away. It wasn't until the medical examiner came to talk to the detectives and said, something's not quite matching up here. Like he's telling you about this many victims and what we're finding, and what he said he's disposed of and how he's disposed of them, either in the toilet or in garbage bags. Something's missing. Like there's something missing here. And they came to the conclusion, because of course they'd also been going through his kitchen and his apartment, and they were finding like cutlery with like encrusted flesh on it, and a big thing on the pot, a big pot on the stove that had some body parts in there. So they kind of came to the conclusion that maybe he had been eating his victims. So they brought that to Jeff, and this could have been a thing where they just sort of said, like, how come you never told us this? And really kind of got mad at him about it. But they just sort of presented it, and they said, well, why didn't you tell us about this earlier? And Dahmer actually said, I didn't want you to think worse of me. So that was kind of his mindset there. But I think almost, and I kind of pointed it out, and I mean, it was just sort of my opinion, but I said, there wasn't really that much of an age difference between Pat and Dahmer, like only about 5 years or 6 years difference. And I kind of thought, maybe at first Kennedy kind of was like a big brother to him, almost, like, because he didn't have that kind of a relationship. He had a younger brother. Dahmer had a younger brother, but he didn't have that sort of older brother. The other thing with Kennedy is that they had the alcoholism, in common. And when Kennedy was first starting out, before he became a police officer, and prior to that, he had been a social worker for many years, he had actually contemplated becoming a minister, like a priest. And so I think that idea of the confessional, and creating it, it might be an interrogation room with no windows and, no personality, but he managed to make a safe space for Dahmer. And but as far as how it ended, I think it was just a matter of like, let's just tick off the victims, like I think they realized, okay, he's got 17 victims. One they couldn't actually prove, and so they didn't go forward with the case because there was literally nothing left of that victim in Milwaukee. There was no souvenir that Dahmer had left. There was no body part, bones, skull, nothing. There was absolutely nothing. Dahmer was able to say, I met this man. I brought him back to my apartment. I drugged him. I strangled him, and I killed him. But there was absolutely nothing left of him. So they decided that was maybe going to be too tentative a case. So they didn't go forward with it. But of course, there was this big victim 9 years earlier in Ohio, that, well, 9 years in terms of the difference between that when he'd killed that young hitchhiker and then when he had started up again in Milwaukee. They had no clue that there was a victim in Ohio, but it wasn't until he mentioned it. And he said, I actually did kill somebody when I was like a much younger person, and it was this guy, and it was in Ohio. And he kind of described the circumstances of how he met, and he described what he had done with the body. And so they were actually able to go back so many years later and find, I think they found some bone chips, and they also found a retainer, part of a retainer, which they were able to identify back to the victim. But they said, we would not have had any idea about that victim in Ohio if it hadn't been for Dahmer.
So that's fascinating. Serial killers are by nature serial killers. They do it to they have a compulsion. They kill. You may catch them, or they may never get caught. You may catch them early in their serial killing sort of career, or you may catch them at a later part. There could be people who've killed 20, 30, 40 people, and they probably will remember most of them because it's a very big moment to them. But one of the things you pointed out before that I thought was fascinating, and it's so true. When you talk to someone who is truly a criminal or a killer or a rapist or somebody who does things that society views as heinous and criminal, they will always hold on to something for their dignity. And now in this case, it seems like he was okay admitting he was a necrophiliac. It's okay to have sex with the dead bodies you just killed, but I would never eat them, right? That's his red line. That's his line in the sand. That, no, 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 I'm not that guy. And I can't tell you how many, anybody who's on this, who's listening to this at any point or watching us, if you've ever interrogated bad guys, that 95 or higher percent of them will tell you, but I'm not a bad guy. They always want to have some semblance
Yeah.
of, I'm not the worst you've ever talked to. And it's really odd. It strikes you as odd. And I'm certain Pat had to step out of his own sense of right, wrong, his own sense of convictions to sit with a guy like Dahmer and have that rapport where you play along with that to get him to feel comfortable so he can talk. And you do it, and there's times when you feel like you just want to go home and take a shower because I just had to enter a whole different twilight zone of what's
Yeah.
right and wrong and what's acceptable, and I had to do it convincingly. So that's part of interrogating that takes a little while, and at times we've laughed about it many times, talking about, yeah, this guy did all this stuff, and then he said to me, "I'm not a bad guy." No, you're not. Of course not. Anybody would have did what you did in your circumstance. And you can't be too gratuitous about it because you have
There's
to be
two
believable.
Jeffries, right? The good Jeffrey, the bad Jeffrey.
Right.
Yeah.
He just, he's not a bad guy. He's just misunderstood. But he would
Yeah.
never go as far as cannibalism. That's crossing a line. It just struck me as it's a common theme among murderers and
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
like that. They hold on to that one
Yeah.
thing that I didn't do that. Wow,
Well,
fascinating.
interesting that you say that, Dan, because I mean that they at one point, they of course when they realized that they had Dahmer and that he was a bad guy and he committed a lot of crimes, they kind of do that timeline, right? Like, it's like, well, where was he in all this different time prior to us catching him? So they're investigating different places where he had lived and the times that he lived there and where there are they bodies or deaths that had not been accounted for at that time. So when they realized that when he got out of the army, he had been sent to Miami, it was around the same time that Adam Walsh had gone missing. And so when they realized, severed head and he had been in the same area, they were wanting to talk to him about Adam Walsh. And so they
Wow.
the two FBI agents came and talked to, first of all, talked to Pat and his partner, and then they wanted to talk to Dahmer. And Dahmer was actually offended. Like, he's like, that's a little kid. Like, they showed him a picture of him. That's a little child. Like, I'm not interested in kids. And Pat actually had to remind him and said, well, what about that one boy who was like 13? Well, I thought he was older. He looked older to me. And he truly believed that. He said, I thought he was like 17 or 18 years old. But, the idea, like, I can do all these other things, but I certainly wouldn't hurt a kid.
Right.
Morals.
Mm.
A whole different standard, a whole different
Wow.
standard. So, based upon your knowledge of what Pat learned during his interrogation and what the investigation yielded, do you think, or is there still a belief that there were other victims of Jeffrey Dahmer that were not tied to him?
I tend to believe what Pat believed. And he said, I think that Dahmer came clean with us because I think like once you get to like 16, 17 victims, like, you've already admitted that much. Like, I'll tell you about victim number 17, but number 18, that's off limits. I think they felt that he really needed to unburden himself at this point. I mean, I'm sure there are people who think, oh, there's other victims that they don't know about and that he only talked about those ones that they could somehow piece, but I don't know. I just think that he really did want to come clean. Like, he really did want to sort of tell his story. I don't think it was about amounts of body, a body count. Like, I don't think it was like, oh, well, I want to have the most. I think it was more just that, you caught me. And if I can bring some peace to the family members of these people who I killed, I'll do that. That's the least I can do. So I tend to believe that he was pretty honest about, but I've heard other things. Like, they were saying, well, there were victims maybe when he was in Germany, when he was in the army and stationed there, so I don't know. I tend to think that, though, that he did tell the police everything and that, he told them about all the victims.
Wow. So there comes a point in time when now they have to go to court. Now the trial starts, and I'm sure Pat is the center of the trial, other than Jeffrey. Uh, what was said about that? His notes, any recollection you have with a conversation with the trial process? Because now Pat's got to take everything he got from Jeffrey and talk about it. It's not just writing notes down anymore. Now he's got to explain it. And that's a whole another level of emotions, another level of expertise that he has to get Jeffrey's words into the heads of jurors now. Uh, Take us through that with Pat's recollection or your recollection through Pat of the trial.
Well, initially, yeah, Kennedy was, told and was convinced that he was going to be testifying. There was some sort of a mix-up or some sort of a decision, kind of at the last minute, where they said, you know what, we're going to put Dennis Murphy on, who was Pat's partner and the more seasoned of the two detectives. They said, we're just going to let him testify, and Kennedy, you don't have to testify. And I think he was actually quite offended. He was a miffed. He's like, I spent all this time with this guy, and I kind of feel like I got to know him really well, and I think I can present him really well to the jury. And then at the very last minute, they said, okay, no, Kennedy, you go up. And so he had an opportunity where he could have actually taken like a binder of information with him up to the stand. But he chose not to, because he said, I want these jurors and everyone else here to realize how much I studied the case, and how much, it wasn't just a matter of taking the guy's story, but he said, I really, I purposely remember everything about what he told us. And so that was his coverage, actually. Like when he was in court, they were asking him questions about probably that first night, as well as just in terms of, him telling all of these things, and coming clean with all of the victims that he had killed. And I guess also too, that idea of like, was he sort of doing anything that made you think that he wasn't of his right mind? Like, does it seem like he was sane? Because that's really what it was. Like Dahmer, he confessed, and so he was found guilty, but it was really a matter of whether or not he was going to be found insane or not. So his trial was really about his sanity.
He didn't put up a defense to the killing. He admitted he did the killings. He had already spent days, weeks chronicling that. Backing away from that would be impossible.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, and as part of his own defense too, like he wasn't saying, well, I'm stark raving mad. He had his lawyers saying to him, we want you to be interviewed. And so he said, well, maybe there is something wrong with me. Maybe there was a reason why I did what I did. But, I don't think there was anything that they could find, mentally, that would have caused him to commit the crimes that he did. I mean, he had a lot of personality problems, to say the least.
Yeah.
Issues with fantasy and other problems as well. But he wasn't sort of mentally ill by the standard that you would need.
That's amazing. That's interesting. On the surface, the average person would look at that and say, you have to be crazy to do that. But it's a whole different level, a whole different type of evaluation that's done for a court for legal purposes by professionals, and we're not professionals. So
Well, and
this
that was,
story is...
Kennedy and I did talk about that, because I said to him, like, did you think that he was crazy? Like, even if the psychiatrists and the doctors didn't come to any kind of like a single conclusion, I was curious about Kennedy's opinion on it. And he said that he thought he was crazy, because he said to have those kinds of desires, to have those kind of fantasies, not just that you're wanting to think about it, but that you want to act upon it, that you want to actually cut open a body, that you want to eat a body, that you want to have sex with a dead body. To him, that's what makes a person crazy, was those wanting to do them and doing them.
Wow. Now, was Patrick...
Sounds logical to me.
Was Patrick still alive when Dahmer got killed in prison?
Yeah.
How did that go?
You know what? Actually, I think Kennedy, he said, he said there was sort of a sadness about it, because he said, he didn't dislike Dahmer. Like he said, Dahmer was nice to him. Like they talked, and they, in between their interrogations and interviews and stuff, like they, would crack jokes and talk about things that were in the newspaper. They had lunch together several times. So, I don't think he hated Dahmer. Like, I don't think I remember when I first mentioned about, the relationship between Dahmer and Kennedy, he kind of bristled, because he's like, I don't think we had a relationship. But in the end, he kind of realized that they did. It was kind of a friendship. He didn't maintain any kind of like correspondence or go visit him or anything like that. He said that would have been wholly inappropriate. But he said, he cared about him. Like he was, concerned, like how he was making out in prison. They were hearing rumors that, Dahmer wanted to go from being in isolation to going into the general population, and they all agreed. They said that's a death sentence. He shouldn't do that, because he's so notorious that he will get killed. So I think from that point of view, he was sort of, concerned about Jeff's safety, and thinking that shouldn't happen in prison. You go to prison to be punished, but you should be killed in prison. They don't have a death penalty in Wisconsin, or they didn't at that time anyway. And so I think he was actually sad to hear that what had happened to him. And Kennedy was quite taken. I remember him telling me a couple of times, quite taken with the fact that when they discovered Dahmer's body, like he had no defense wounds at all. Like he said, if you're being attacked, if someone's hitting you with something, like the guy that killed him in prison actually coincidentally killed him with the weight, like a handlebar of a weight, which is the very first instrument of death that Dahmer had used so many years earlier. But he said Dahmer didn't have any bruises on his arms. He didn't try and block any of the blows. He just kind of stood there and took it. So he said, like, I guess in his mind, he realized, like when he made that order, when he actually signed that desire to be put into general population, he must have known that his time was going to be, his days were numbered. And so I think there was sort of a sadness about that. Not that he didn't think that Dahmer deserved to be in prison for the rest of his life. He did deserve that. He said, Dahmer, for all that he said he was just really a very selfish man. His orgasm was more important than those victims' lives, is basically what it kind of boiled down to. So, I don't think he was surprised that Dahmer was killed, but I think he was kind of sad, actually.
Wow.
I think he thinks, actually, too, they could have learned so much more about him. I mean, he was only in prison for about 3.5 years. Like, he went in, and then a few years later, he was killed. I think that they thought that they could have learned more about, the makings of Dahmer.
Right.
Sure. Oh, yeah.
So as to be able to identify people in the future who are exhibiting such behaviors before they go on to kill. Yeah.
Right.
It would have been fascinating,
especially because
to
Dahmer was so forthcoming, like if people asked him questions, he answered them, like he was not one to say, well, I don't want to talk to you guys, or you're the experts, you don't need me. Like, he was really willing to talk to, anybody who wanted to talk to him. I think he was very curious about, his own behavior and the decisions that he had made and what prompted him to do the things that he did.
Wow. Robyn
You know what?
Maharaj.
I would have loved
Tremendous.
to have. Yeah,
Go ahead, Tom.
I would have loved to have had a video of those interrogations, because nowadays, then it would be a clinic on how to
Yes.
do an interrogation.
Right.
Because everything that you described, Robyn, with what he wrote down in his notes of doing, and your recollection of what he told you, is just textbook to get whoever it is in front of you, the worst serial killer in history, killing your family, whatever. The point is to get that person to trust you, to bring them down to a certain level, and to get what you need from them, however it may be. And he did everything correctly, to obtain that. I mean, like I said, you're not waking up going to work every day thinking you're going to interview Jeffrey Dahmer. And for him to do that was incredible. And your, somewhat participation in his memory is just so great. It's fascinating. Listening to you, it's like listening to Patrick. Your description and everything, and it's like listening to him. And you should be really, really proud of yourself with this book and what you've done for Patrick's memory.
Well, I really wanted it to be like I don't know whether, had he lived and we worked on it together, I don't know whether he would have wanted me to put this in there, but because he had passed away, I thought, this is an opportunity for it to be a legacy for his kids, his family, his grandkids, and also a little bit to tell us the story. So I did put a little bit of his own background, what his life was prior to the Dahmer case and life after the Dahmer case.
Right.
And just a little bit of a biography of him. He was a very special, detective. We didn't know each other very long, but he was definitely a very good friend, and I really cared for him, and I was so appreciative of him sharing the story with me. He was so open. He was so willing to talk about it. And I think it would have, had he lived, I just wish he had seen the final product of it, because, it's all his story.
Yep. Well, you did him and you did his family great honor, but you also shared an inside look at what it's like to be a true professional, thrust into a role that the world is watching at a moment that you least expected it, and to rise to that occasion as he did. And it's something for all of us who have ever done that kind of work to look at, marvel, and say, that's how it's done. That's the way it's done. So we like to highlight that kind of work and those types of cases on this show. And Robyn, we cannot thank you enough for coming in, sharing your recollection, your memories, what you've learned. And it's just been an honor having you here. And thank you so much. And we can't wait. Please tell everyone about your book
Thank you.
and any other stuff that you have going on.
I love the idea of your I love the idea of your show, and as I had said earlier, like, I love detective stories. So to really truly show the hard work that goes in and the sacrifice that goes in, and the things you fellows miss out on because you're really, the determination that you have to do the job, and those personal sacrifices, and the toll that it will take. Like we talked a little bit about how it might have affected Kennedy throughout the rest of his life, and many of the detectives I've ever talked to, they have those cases that have deeply impacted, their outlook and their view of the job for sure.
Yep.
Well, the world or people in general.
So,
You're right.
so Dan, we say it again. We keep finding these guests, and
I don't know.
Robyn actually fell right into our lap, literally, in it. So we have this thing that's going, and uh, we get these guests that just blow us away. I mean, literally, Robyn,
Amazing.
I sat here just marveling at your story and recollection of the book and his notes, and became a fan. Dan says it a lot, with shows that we do, and you end up just sitting here just taking in everything you're saying, trying to figure a question out for you. And your work is just incredible. The book, your memory for Patrick, and it's just tip your hat to you. You're
Oh,
a true
thank you very much.
professional.
It was absolutely a labor of love. Like, when you're a writer, it's exciting to have a book, but really it was a labor of love because I thought, he had this heart attack. He passed away. And in fact, this is sort of a weird coincidence, but I had a heart attack when I was 36, and it was the actual date, like the date, April 18th, that he died from his heart attack. It was the same
Wow.
date that I'd had my heart attack
Wow.
6 years
Wow.
earlier. And so, I mean, it was it kind of bonded us almost, and I was so devastated when I learned of his passing, and I was just so committed to getting his story out there, because I thought, he can't have his story shelved just because he's not here to tell it. So
Good,
it was really an honor to work on his story.
good for
And if
you.
it can help other people, help other detectives, or help other people who are interested in true crime with a better understanding, and then that's just icing on the cake.
Yep.
Very
Well,
good.
we can't thank you enough, and we will look forward to your
Thanks, you guys.
to other work that you put out, because we know there'll be more. We want to stay in touch. We'd love to have you back on the show at some point, and all the best to you,
Sure. Well, I'd
Robyn.
love to talk to you guys about your stories. You guys could do go. You guys have a collection of stories that you could put into a book. So we'll have
We
to talk.
we can
We'll
follow
talk.
I'd
up
love
with
to
that.
help you guys. You
Yeah.
guys are detectives. I'd love to help you tell your
Uh-huh.
stories. So, yeah, for
We
sure.
we could do that.
Sure.
Definitely.
Yeah.
There you go.
We
We'll
would
keep in
love to
touch.
work with you. Would love to work with you.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
we will let you go. Get back to your life. Thank you so much for your time. And we know this is going to be this compelling show. People will love this one. So thank you again. You honor us. Tom, you
Mhm.
always take
Well,
us
thank
out.
you. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome, Rob. You always take us out, and we'll look forward to our next show. But this is going to be a tough one to beat. Tough one to beat. That's for sure.
Oh yeah. We're thrilled to have people like Robyn in our world, in our Gold Shields world now, and Robyn knows that once you get into the world of NYPD detectives, you're stuck with us. That's
That's
it.
it.
We don't go away. We
Love
don't
it.
leave.
I love it.
Uh, the
You're
text
the gum on your
messages at
shoe now.
holidays, yep, all that. But we just want to thank you again, and a marvelous show. You should be proud of yourself. Patrick's proud of you, without a doubt, sitting on your shoulder, probably while you went through this, and even now. So his memory's alive in your work. So great job on that, and thank you so much for being here. And like we always do, say a prayer for the law enforcement officers throughout this world and in this country and their families. They do a hard job, and they do a dedicated job that sometimes doesn't show up in the newspaper or on the news. 6 weeks, 16 hours a day doesn't show up on the news that Patrick had to do to this case. And he's not the only one. It happens on a daily basis throughout this country. And we have to remember that and keep these officers in our prayers. So fist bump them in the store, wave to them on the street, and say thank you when you can. For Robyn, for Dan, thank you again for another great show. And don't forget, youtube.com/@goldshields. Hit that subscribe button, hit the like button, and keep us going. And thank you again. And everyone out there, please stay safe.